All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Ramsey. I am an analyst at Gartner. I cover the smart mobility and automotive industry and transportation more broadly. And I'm excited to introduce you to Tim Woods. He's the founding partner of POCO Labs and a general manager of the Autonomous Vehicle Alliance. And he's going to be giving us a presentation to look at barrier-free mass transit autonomous vehicles and how design principles can be used to really open up transportation for the benefit of everyone. And I'm really excited to hear what he has to talk about and then open up a conversation between us afterwards. And then we'll take questions from folks after we finish. So without any more preamble to that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim and let him do the presentation, and we'll swing back a little bit later and take questions.
Thank you, Mike. Can everybody see? Hold on one second. Can everybody see the screen? Mike, can you see that?
I can see it.
Wonderful. Okay, let's get started. First of all, I want to say a huge thank you to SAE for allowing us to present this piece of research. Engineers are going to be absolutely critical moving forward to make accessible and barrier-free vehicles in the future. We're at a very critical moment in kind of transportation history where we have an opportunity to do things that we've never been able to do before and look through a different lens at how accessible and barrier-free can actually serve the needs of all. To give a real quick background, the Autonomous Vehicle Alliance was formed about 6 years ago. Our board is made up of General Motors, Ford Motor Company, and Magna International. We have other members such as Dow Chemical, Stantec, and others that participate in this collaborative research. We've been conducting this research for over 5 years, and I will tell you that this piece of research in particular is really a culmination of about 5 years of research. And what I mean by that is that this very specific piece of research actually got approved and was moved forward by our board in December of 2019, based on previous pieces of research that we had conducted with cities. We have been in 5-hour charrettes with the city of Austin, Atlanta, Chicago. The list goes on. We've had pieces of research that we conducted with healthcare systems related to AVs, as well as the aging ecosystem. This, quite frankly, is a culmination of all of that research. So beyond the stakeholder interviews and the end user interviews that we conducted and the ethnography that we did last year, we also have the input of all of those cities. And why that's there is, quite frankly, every single time we spoke with a city, every single time we talked with somebody in the healthcare industry or someone who was in the aging ecosystem, every single time they would say to us, we need an accessible and barrier-free vehicle. And this was a common theme for years. So what we attempted to do here is really to do a deep dive and look at what the opportunity really was for an accessible barrier-free vehicle as it pertains to L4 and L5 AVs. So I'm going to jump through this presentation a little bit because it's about 180 pages, and I want to get to the very salient points here. So this is kind of a general knowledge infographic here. 26% of adults in the United States have some type of disability. And I have to make mention here, those are the ones that will admit that they have a physical or cognitive disability. There are many people who do not because they're just used to whatever is going on in their lives, right? Their physical nature, their cognitive nature. But it also doesn't take into account individuals who may be temporarily disabled. So any of us who have had shoulder surgery or knee surgery or hip or foot, we are temporarily disabled at that moment in time and still need to leverage mobility. I want to get into the core opportunity areas from the very beginning of this, because we could go through all of the details, but I think going through the core areas of opportunity and then really getting to what we would call a journey map. We have multiple journey maps, and what I want to be able to make clear is that this entire piece of research will be available to you if you so desire to have it. I will email it to you. SAE will make it available to you. The contact information is at the back end of this presentation, but just to get started, let's look at the opportunity areas. So in particular, let's look at section 1. So merging the physical world with digital wayfinding tools. We're at a moment in time where we can think about transportation holistically, not just as the vehicle, not just as infrastructure, not just ourselves as pedestrians or drivers of vehicles, but literally as the entire holistic vision around mobility and transportation. When we start to talk about mobility for all and equity, we have to look at merging the physical world with digital wayfinding tools. As much as the vehicle is the physical environment and infrastructure is, we need to understand that there are tools that are being developed, and I would have to say disparately, right? Wayfinding for sidewalks. Eric Sinagra, who is the CEO of Pathview, basically made this wonderful observation that we are pedestrians 99% of the time when we're going from point A to point B. That needs to be integrated into the overall mobility experience. And we need to be able to leverage those tools in a very holistic way so it is a smooth and complete trip. US DOT has been talking about this for years. How do we look from planning the trip all the way through to education to our final destination when we actually walk into that room? So these tools, these digital tools, need to be leveraged in the overall complete trip that we're looking at. And I will tell you very honestly and upfront that when we did this piece of research, we were looking at use cases and value propositions for L4 and L5 AVs. And what this pointed us to was a SAV, or a shuttle AV. Now, we don't get very specific on the form factor, whether this is a 2-person or 1-person or 6 or 12 or 20-person shuttle. We believe there will be multiple form factors in all of this. So we're acknowledging that, but we see this as a potential SAV vehicle that could integrate with mobility services offered by cities and others, which means that we need to look at this from a systems approach, right? How are we looking at all of our assets, whether that's fixed assets like rail or buses or whatever, and how do we integrate SAVs into that mix? Not necessarily replacing those assets, but integrating, so we are taking a systems approach to this. This is one key component that is going to be absolutely critical, which is merging the physical world with digital wayfinding tools, because we're building that off the back of the logistics background that we're going to be building for these SAV vehicles for their integration. One of the main points here is the first bullet point, which is personalization of the mobility experience. In other words, if we're building a back end that will be able to manage this for the individual, for the city, for the healthcare system, for the aging ecosystem, we need to think about personalization. Why? Well, when we think about an individual who uses a manual wheelchair, or someone who has a hearing disability, or someone who may be using an individual who uses a white cane, we need to personalize that mobility experience from beginning to end. In other words, from the planning tools through the whole ride experience to being a pedestrian to getting to our final destination, it needs to be personalized. We have the technology to be able to accomplish this, right? But it's about the individual's willingness to be able to provide this information to the back end so the vehicle can react accordingly. So the infrastructure that the vehicle will be interfacing with will act accordingly. In other words, being able to enable this from a digital perspective based on who you are as an individual. The importance of audio cues are extremely critical, not just to people who may be blind, but also hard of hearing. This is quite frankly a universal design look at this. Audio cues are going to play an important role in being able to wayfind and manage through the entire complete trip. Accessible real-time information. I want to add one word to here: accessible, relevant real-time information. So if we have individuals with cognitive disabilities, they need to know and be able to access information of where they are, what they're doing, where they're going at all times, and quite frankly, at their discretion. So accessible, relevant, real-time information doesn't just help people with cognitive disabilities, it helps all of us, right? Unbanked alternatives. Every single time we have spoken with the city over the last 5 years, Every single one of them talks about equity and mobility, creating equity in transportation. Unbanked alternatives are absolutely key. What do we mean by that? Well, individuals who do not have a credit card, who may not be able to have a bus pass or a transportation pass, individuals who don't have credit cards or bank accounts, those are the unbanked. So how do cities provide that mobility equity for them? How do they pull them out of socioeconomically disenfranchised neighborhoods and get them to jobs, get them to the grocery store, get them to doctor's appointments? We need to think about the sensors that will be involved with this, wearables. It's not just an individual who needs a phone to be able to interface with these things, but we can also look at this from a low-tech, more cost-efficient way of sensors or wearables that they could use. On-demand booking is absolutely critical, particularly with the aging market. When we look at the aging market and the research that we've done with them, in some cases, planning takes 72 hours to plan a trip. There's absolutely nothing spontaneous about needing 72 hours to plan a trip. Also, we're talking about a group of individuals who are going to leverage mobility and transportation to basically bolster their individuality, to bolster their independence, to bolster their social needs, right? Of getting out and getting out to others and having conversations. And then wayfinding for curbs and sidewalks. This, as I said before, an integral part of this whole thing. It is part of the overall journey. So we need to include wayfinding for curbs and sidewalks, particularly with individuals who have physical impairments or physical disabilities that things like unlevel sidewalks, tree roots, construction, all of those things they will need to be aware of to be able to complete the trip successfully. Going into section 2, understanding how universal design language could impact AVs. I'm going to jump to the bottom here and say that we had a very interesting conversation with Stantec, which was the 8th largest engineering and architectural firm in the world. Basically, they build infrastructure, they build airports, they build bus stations, transportation centers, all of those sorts of things. Spoke with a wonderful gentleman called Graham Masterson. And he said, when we're looking at usability, when we're looking at going beyond ADA, we're looking for designing for usability by 85% of the public. That is a huge swath of the general population. What that means and what that points to is that we don't believe that paratransit will go away, but paratransit get more specific in its execution, right? If we can have SAV vehicles that can meet the needs of 85% of the population because we've leveraged universal design, and we're going to talk about those points in just a second, then we have kind of reached a critical goal, right? We can start to think about paratransit in a different way, and we can start to think about mobility for all in a very different way. So when we talk about vehicle interior features, right, what is the design language? How are we going to leverage universal design to be able to create a design language for the interior of the vehicle? And in the next section, I'm going to talk about how we can merge those two worlds. But let's focus first on this. So number one, absolutely number one is ingress egress. And zero entry or level boarding is extraordinarily important, not just for individuals who may be using a white cane, who may be using a walker, who may be using a manual wheelchair, for everyone. Think of mothers with strollers, think of travelers with luggage. Zero entry or level boarding is completely attainable. We can do this. We have the technology to do this. And we give suggestions of how that may be approached. High head clearance is my number 2 in all of this. So beyond zero entry, right, and it's kind of overall coverage for the majority of the public, high head clearance is also related to kind of meeting that 85% needs. And what we mean by that is high head clearance of about 6 feet. In other words, being able to almost literally walk straight into the vehicle and be able to take a seat. Why? Multiple head and neck injuries, multiple back injuries, where bending over or stooping or doing anything of that nature is incredibly painful for a huge chunk of the population. This goes beyond the disabled and people just with neck and back injuries. So high head clearance is extremely important. vehicle design cues that we can leverage across multiple areas. In other words, infrastructure, the vehicle itself. What does the vehicle look like? What does it feel like? What does the interior look and feel like to the individual who's using that vehicle? And finally, section 3, which is coordination of design languages between vehicles and infrastructure. I call this the big duh. And what I mean by that is we're at a moment in time in history where we have an opportunity to coordinate the vehicle design and infrastructure languages together. In other words, if we're creating spaces that are going to use colors or iconography, those sorts of things in the vehicle, we need to pull those out of the vehicle and leverage those in infrastructure. In other words, pick up and drop off, transportation centers, onboarding areas for subways, for buses, for SAVs, for individual vehicles. This idea of being able to coordinate vehicle and infrastructure design has really kind of been a lightning rod and has started to take off. We have the ability for OEMs for the first time in history to start to talk with the people who create the infrastructure and to be able to coordinate those design languages together. So the other thing we need to look at here is also the vehicle creating its own infrastructure where needed. Not all infrastructure is perfect. It's not all created equal. If you get out into rural areas with dirt roads or rock-based roads, you get into suburbs that have no sidewalks, right? They're just streets and houses. You need the ability for the vehicle to create its own infrastructure. And what we mean by that is, and we'll give examples of this when I take you through a journey map, is the vehicle projecting arrows onto the ground or green squares where the entrance and exit is to the vehicle. The ability for the vehicle to coordinate with the individual user on a personal level of do they need to turn left or they need to turn right when they leave the vehicle. And then addressing curb opportunities for rural and suburban pickup and drop off. This is an area that we really need to take an intense look at. We did a very kind of deep dive on urban deployment, but suburban and rural are just as important in the future as we start to move forward with these opportunities. So I'm going to scroll through the deck here and I'm going to take us to a journey map, because the journey map, and I will be very honest with you up front, has been a great way of kind of telling the story of everything we learned. So all of the details are in the deck. You'll be able to access those when you receive the deck. But what the journey maps represent is a maximized, accessible, and barrier-free vehicle, infrastructure, and enabling digital backend. We've included individuals with various abilities and circumstances to call out functional details and needs in those areas. So these journey maps represent a fully integrated approach to mobility and potential new customers for an autonomous fleet vehicle. I want you to take very close note to what we're saying in the first journey map that we're going to be sharing, because in that journey map, we have integrated the conversations that we've been having with Chicago over the years. Other journey maps will represent other geographies, other areas, other deployments of vehicles with people with various forms of abilities. This one in particular focuses on an individual who uses a cane, a white cane. So an individual who is considered legally blind and cannot drive a vehicle. So I'm going to walk you through this. And what I'd love to do is have a robust kind of Q&A and just open discussion on the back end of this. So Carly is a 32-year-old African-American woman with a vision impairment. She lives on the south side of Chicago in the Douglas neighborhood. Carly is a customer service consultant. She can recognize primary colors, but is considered legally blind, which results in Carly using a cane to navigate her way through the world. Today, Carly is going to a new client's office for the first time. I want to stop here for a moment, because when we were doing this research, we actually reached out to the American Council for the Blind, who has actually two working committees, one that works on infrastructure and the one that works on vehicles. And we asked them the question, what is the easiest trip for you to take as an individual who may be blind? And what is the most difficult trip for you to take? And they came back with such a clear and concise answer that we actually built it into this journey map. So they said to us, listen, my issues are not related to going to the doctor or going to work. I do those things every day or frequently enough that I'm very familiar with the infrastructure around me. I'm very familiar on how to get there and what vehicles I'll be using. But the most difficult trip for me is when you ask me to go somewhere for the first time. My efforts quadruple compared to an individual who may have all of their abilities. The anxiety, the level of stress, not knowing where I'm going, what forms of mobility will be available to me, what the infrastructure will look and feel like, all of those are undetermined when you ask me to go to someplace for the first time. And we step back from that and we ask ourselves, well, don't we all get a little bit anxiety and stressed out when we're going someplace for the first time? Think of a work trip where they're asking you to go to a city for the first time. How are you going to get to the client? How are you going to get to the job site? What is it going to take, right? That causes stress and anxiety. And it is a multiplier effect when we start talking to people who have a disability. So she's living with an impairment. She's blind. She uses a cane to navigate her way through the world. Today, Carly is going to a new client's office for the first time, making this a new journey for her. Her new client is in Schiller Park on Chicago's west side. She will be using her new CTA app to plan her trip. This allows her to plan her journey door to door. Now there's a little asterisk on this that says the trip is being paid for through the app and is verified for payment by sensors installed at the entrance and exits to various vehicles. The sensors will pick up the user's phone or a wearable that they may have on them. So at 7:30 a.m., Carly opens her CTA app, which allows her to plan her trip with audio prompts. The CTA app is fully integrated mobility platform and considers all forms of both private and public transportation options. The CTA app will aggregate those options to maximize the efficiency of her trip. The app asks, "What is your point of origin?" Carly responds by giving her condo address. The app then asks, "What is your final destination?" Carly responds with the office address of her client. Finally, the app asks, "What time do you need to be at your final destination?" Carly responds 10 a.m. Within 10 seconds, the app responds with her itinerary, letting her know an automated vehicle will pick her up at the curb outside of her building at 8:45 a.m. The app then asks, "Do you want to confirm this trip?" Carly responds yes. Carly can review her mobility options at any time during her trip. This is also extraordinarily important for people with cognitive abilities. The app will then identify each type and mode of transportation. For this trip, it will include an AV, bus, train, and end with another AV. At 8:45 a.m. at the designated time, a 4-person AV shuttle owned by CTA pulls to the front curb at her condo. The AV has the ability to move both up and down 6 inches. This helps the vehicle create a zero entry capability with a small slide out ramp that covers the gap between the vehicle and sidewalk. Because Carly has created a profile with CTA on the app, the vehicle knows in advance that Carly is a person with a vision impairment and that she uses a cane to maneuver. As soon as the AV stops, it laser measures the curb height and raises 2 inches to deploy the ramp. The vehicle also projects a green square or arrow onto the sidewalk where the entrance to the vehicle is. Because Carly can make out primary colors, this helps her navigate into the vehicle. The vehicle not only has a zero entrance capability, but also a high head clearance of 6 feet, so she can walk right in without ducking. At 8:50 a.m., as the doors start to close behind her, Carly gets an audio prompt through her headphones that the green areas on the floor of the vehicle indicate seating areas. Carly uses her cane to identify an open seat and sits down. At 9 a.m., Carly gets an audio prompt that her AV will be arriving at the bus stop in the next 2 minutes and to gather her things. At 9:02 a.m., Carly's AV arrives at the bus shelter and she is instructed to wait for the bus, which will arrive in 5 minutes. The shelter itself uses the same primary color scheme to denote safe areas to stand and sit. The shelter also uses textured concrete to delineate where the edge of the curb is. This design language has been coordinated with the vehicle's interior design language to help all passengers navigate easily. At 9:07 a.m., Carly's bus arrives and uses the same technology used in the AV. Laser measuring the curb and deploys the ramp, which is used by all passengers for boarding. In addition, the bus projects the green square entrance onto the sidewalk surface to mark the entrance to the bus. At 9:08 a.m., Carly's bus doors close and she listens to the audio prompts and follows primary colors to identify seating inside. The CTA app lets her know that she will be arrived at the train station in 15 minutes. At 9:21 a.m., Carly receives an audio prompt that her bus will arrive at the train station in 2 minutes and to gather her things. The audio prompt also informs her that the elevator to the raised platform is 25 feet to her left as she leaves the bus. At 9:23 a.m., Carly arrives at the train station and makes her way to the elevator. As she's exiting the bus, the app lets her know that her train will arrive in 3 minutes. At 9:26 a.m., Carly's train arrives. The same design language used in the AV, bus, and bus shelter are also used here on the train platform. The same primary colors and floor texturing are used to denote all areas. As the train stops on the platform, it similarly projects green squares onto the platform to show where the doors are. At 9:26 a.m., the doors close behind Carly and she makes her way to her seat. The audio prompt informs her that the ride out to Schiller Park will take 2 minutes longer than expected due to slowdowns on the line. Total time to Schiller Park is 20 minutes. At 9:45 a.m., Carly is informed that her train will arrive at the Schiller Park station in 2 minutes. She gathers her briefcase and bag. At 9:47 a.m., Carly's train arrives and she receives an audio prompt that her AV shuttle is parked on her side of the street, 50 feet to the left as she exits the train platform. At 9:49 a.m., Carly enters the AV. As she finds her seat, she receives an audio prompt that the AV will arrive at her final destination at 9:58 a.m. At 9:58 a.m., Carly arrives at her client's offices. As she exits the AV, her audio prompt informs her that the entrance door for her client is 75 feet directly in front of her. At 10 a.m., Carly arrives at her final destination. So that's taking you through the first journey map, but I want you to know that there are multiple journey maps in this deck that you can refer to. Those for individuals with a hearing impairment, those aging who are leveraging a caregiver, and just an individual who's generally using an AV shuttle for, let's say, rush hour for the morning and the afternoon commutes, who may not own a vehicle. So I'm going to leave it at this moment in time because we're at 12:28. And hand it back to Michael so we can have a discussion and Q&A.
Yeah, great. Can you see me? I'm trying to see Stephanie. I don't know if.
Let me see. I'm gonna stop sharing. Maybe that will help.
Yeah, because I just see Stephanie White in very. There we go.
I see you.
I'd be curious, actually, Tim, like, one of the things that pulling away from that, obviously, you spoke to a lot of different cities and got a few things that I pulled away is it requires a lot of coordination between entities right now that do no coordination, and there really isn't a lot of way to make them coordinate well together outside of a big effort. Did you make some recommendations in this report about how you could get started with this? Like what would be the first step? Is it, I mean, we're obviously talking to a group of engineers who may be involved in design.
Right.
Does the industry from our side, do we need to start on some of these things or where do we get started on this?
Absolutely, Michael. And the timing is absolutely critical because so many designs are being locked down with the vehicle manufacturers. So number one, what we wanted to do starting in December of last year is really provide this piece of research to everyone who is interested in receiving it. It has been very much a lightning rod, and I will tell you that our OEMs are really turning a critical eye to accessible and barrier-free in a way that we've never seen in the past, which is very heartwarming. But we need to go well beyond that, as you suggest. And this is there are parts of this that are monumental efforts, but they are worth the effort. So as an example, ITSA, Intelligent Transportation Society of America, is really looking at how can we coordinate conversations between OEMs and the people that create infrastructure. Not just the people who pay for infrastructure, but the people who actually create it, the AECOMs of the world, the Stantec's of the world, as well as regional transportation authorities and cities themselves, because the level of coordination, as you so well pointed out, is absolutely critical moving forward. So we have opportunities here with SAE today to get this message out with engineers. We want to be able to do the exact same thing with automotive designers, with IDSA. So this is kind of a long tail effort that's going to be happening. I will tell you one of the things that has been very motivational for us at the AVA is, for the first time, we worked with outside entities, and those outside entities were ITSA and AARP. As I said, we had 5 years of research prior to this that we were also leveraging. What has happened is that since we have produced this piece of research and we started sharing it with the world, we've actually been going through the process of building off of this research. And what I mean by that is ITSA took what we did and turned it into a webinar where we brought in multiple factions of people from multiple ecosystems to kind of talk about this and how we would move these 3 buckets forward. All of that information has then been handed over to the US Access Board, which is an intergovernmental agency that shares this information with the people like the Department of Labor and USDOT and NHTSA. Beyond that, M-City at the University of Michigan and their accessibility working group has taken all of our learnings from ITSA in the webinar and is now producing another webinar that's happening June 8th that we're going to be building that information on. The purpose of this, and our multiple partners like CalSTART and AARP and ITSA and US Access Board, is to work together and by December of this year have a roadmap of recommendations for both the vehicle and infrastructure that will then be handed off to the US Access Board to disseminate between the intergovernmental agencies. I think that this is a good first step for us kind of being able to move this forward because as you kind of alluded to, we want to move away from what we call the rinse and repeat. There are multiple agencies out there, multiple organizations who are all working on very similar things. We want to actually coordinate that so we're building and we can get there faster, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, I one of the things that I just a little bit more tactically, and there's a question up here already, you know, about how engineers could do this, but more tactically, some of the things that I heard you say were ground level entrance, you know, and with the design of new shuttles or even vehicles more broadly, lowering the entrance height or creating more capability to enter vehicles. That seems to be, if that's the top recommendation, and then also more headroom. I get that. So more headroom, more lower entering height, and then the use of primary colors, at least for you know, standardized primary colors for signals that, you know. So can you kind of, what would be the list if I was going down an engineering list and I said, okay, check.
So let's start with the physical nature of this, right?
Okay.
Because there's 2 parts to this. There's the physical and there's the digital. And digital really didn't play a role in the past. It's going to play an enormous role in the future. So when we talk about physical, still my number 1 is entry egress, right? So going into the vehicle, coming out of the vehicle on a level boarding surface. And we have the technology right now, hydraulics. We see it in deployments of vehicles that are currently entering the market, where the vehicle itself as a whole can raise and lower itself, right? So meeting that curbs are going to be extremely important to be able to negotiate in pickup and drop off. So being able to get level with the curb and creating that bridge, right, that, or covering that gap so it's less of a tripping hazard, is extremely critical. Number 2, high head clearance. These another physical deployment, right? Another physical thing that we can address. Get it, if we can get it up to 6 feet, that would be absolutely perfection. It may not meet the needs of everybody, but 85% of the population is going to be able to walk straight into that vehicle. So that's absolutely critical. Then I would fall back to design language. What are the design languages that we're going to create inside of these vehicles and with infrastructure? And how could we coordinate those two things together? Because what we really want is for anyone, whether you are disabled or not, to be able to go to anywhere in this country and to be able to take public transportation or transportation in general and to be able to negotiate where they are, where they need to stand, where they need to go, that sort of thing. So I would say entry egress, high head clearance, and design languages from the physical part of this are extremely critical to start working on now. The secondary part of this, and what I mean that is, it's not necessarily secondary, but it is secondary to the physical, which is the digital component. How do we build in wayfinding tools into the applications that we're using to plan a complete trip? In other words, from the moment I decide I want to go somewhere to booking that travel to actually getting there, how do I negotiate that? How do I make that happen? All of that is digital wayfinding tools. And many of these things are being worked on right now, but being worked on disparately. In other words, not in conjunction with the overall mobility experience, but for very specific executions, to be clear. So what we need to do is we need to think about this holistically and pull those people into these conversations. They then become resources for the OEMs that are building back ends that they want to be able to provide to cities and healthcare and the aging ecosystems.
You know, one of the things that we spoke about, Tim, before, you know, we did this presentation together, or we're before this presentation, is that in design, as most of the engineers probably know, a lot of things designed for people who have disabilities also help people who are fully functional in a lot of the same ways. I mean, I think about this, certainly not disability, don't let her hear this, but my wife is a little on the petite side. And when she really doesn't like getting in SUVs that are super high up in the air.
Yeah.
So we ended up buying an SUV for our family that was a little bit lower to the ground. Mm-hmm. And I think that this, you know, this thought process about whether you're, you know, what groups you're serving, you can get a little myopic if you say, oh yeah, we've got to meet the standard for this, this small group of people, when instead you could be thinking, we are creating capability for a very large group of people.
Yes.
That also has potential huge impact for a small group of people. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Like, with autonomy, I mean, I started covering autonomy a while ago, and its purpose in life started from very specific military applications to keep people safe in logistics operations or in security in military theater, right? Yep. And then it grew into something that was designed primarily, my memory is, for safety. And then it became more of a mobility service business model, which is where a lot of the focus went. One of the things that has rarely been talked about, although Google has done a decent job of talking about this, is its power for accessibility. Like, its number one use case could be for driving people who cannot drive on their own. Could you talk a little bit about that in terms of your research, and whether your research addresses it, and what sort of, is there any economic research you did in terms of like the value of AVs could have for this group of people who could not drive otherwise, in terms of improving the quality of life, accessibility, or anything like that?
Absolutely. So, you know, the thing about universal design is it's for all. That's how you're approaching universal design, right? It's how do we meet the needs of all in a way that benefits everyone, right? So that 85% that we're talking about really kind of is getting at that universal design point. And we need to stop talking about this as an obligation and more as an opportunity. In other words, we're not building accessible vehicles because we feel there's an obligation there. We're building these vehicles because there is an innate opportunity here, right? By doing that. Now, when you start to talk about the certain level of disenfranchised groups, the depth of knowledge that we have with cities talking about socioeconomically disenfranchised neighborhoods in their own cities, and being able to get these people, right? And I mean all people, not just those with disabilities, but all people, to jobs, to the grocery store, to the doctor's office. It's an enormous need. And by doing that, we lift people up, we pull them out of poverty because we're enabling their transportation and mobility, which is going to be absolutely critical moving forward. If you can't get to a job, if you can't do certain things, you're cut out of that society, and you become, quite frankly, the society has to take care of you in a different way, right? They have to meet your needs in a different way. Why not provide these people with independence? Why not give them the opportunity to normalize transportation for them so they can do what everyone else is doing, right? And by doing such, we lift entire neighborhoods up, we lift cities up, and the economic impact is broad, because now we're decreasing what we're paying out for unemployment, we're decreasing things for Medicare, all these other things, because we're getting people the opportunity to normalize transportation and to be able to go anywhere at any time like anyone else.
Tim, one of the things that is, I think, implied when we talk about autonomy is that, and you mentioned a little bit in your very first slide about shuttles or the form factor for this.
Yeah.
Now, there are a handful of slow-moving autonomous shuttles out there. Other than local motors, I'm not really sure that the other two, the Easy Mile and Navia shuttles, are designed specifically with full accessibility in mind.
Yeah.
But I know Local Motors is. Do you have any insight into some of the things we know are coming down the pipe from, or at least from, we've seen demos from Zoox and from Cruise.
Yeah.
About.
Oh, you're gonna get me to say something bad about somebody I know.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is, with some of the recommendations you have, the things that we know might be coming down the pipe, so to speak, are they following some of the ideas for accessibility? Are they going to really, or are they, without casting aspersions, my question before was a little bit about, we focus so heavily on mobility as a service, and that's fine. I think that that's great. But there's a specific group of people who can benefit way more than just like average Joes, and they're this group of people, right? And are the new shuttles designed to meet their needs?
Yeah, designed to meet their needs. So you're right. May Mobility, Local Motors, Navia, they've all talked about handicapped accessibility, and many of them have been testing these executions, right? What does that mean? What does it mean from ramp height and the incline? They're working with people like the US Access Board to really look at ADA requirements and how could that be integrated into the vehicle. That is all well and good. All of that is effort moving all of this kind of ecosystem, the potential around this ecosystem forward. But I'm going to point out to someone a company that did, I can honestly say, if they'd had one conversation with one city or somebody in the aging industry or somebody in healthcare, this vehicle would not have been designed this way. And that vehicle is, unfortunately, the Zoox vehicle, which was just purchased, I believe, Michael, by Amazon, purchased them. And here you have hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the development of this vehicle. Bi-directional capabilities, high speed, can go at 75 miles an hour. But when you look at the form factor of the vehicle, there's absolutely nothing accessible about that vehicle. The ability to get in and out of that vehicle is constrained both by high head height and ingress egress. It is also completely and utter constrained by maneuverability inside of the vehicle once you get inside. So my point here is, all of us, if we work for an independent vehicle manufacturer, right, the smaller groups like May Mobility and others, if we're talking with large OEMs, think about the vehicle holistically in the environment that it's going to be operating in and with the people that are going to need it the most, right? And this is why we're pushing so hard on universal design and listening not just to the people who are going to be procuring these vehicles, because we believe this is a new opportunity for so many, right? Because right now, cities, healthcare, and aging industry is not necessarily customers of the OEMs. These are new potential customers. It's really looking beyond that and thinking about the entire journey, the entire vehicle, the infrastructure holistically. When you do that, you stop thinking about things with blinders on, that you're just producing this vehicle for millennials between the ages of X and Y, right? And who are outdoorsy. You know what I mean? This is a very different scenario that we're looking at.
Well, you know, kind of shifting gears a little bit, I've been thinking about this. You talked a lot about digital, and I think that your journey maps really showed to me how important a really good intermodal app is. You know, there are apps out there that are starting. I mean, I will tell you from my practice inside of Gartner, probably the biggest trend that I see on a global basis is that cities and regions are either have already adopted or are planning to adopt some sort of intermodal planning app that would do, you know, planning across multiple forms of transportation, public and private, sometimes incorporating payment, you know, often incorporating directions. So they're already headed in this direction. But what you're talking about, you know, at least from what I saw, is not just the, hey, your train's coming, or, you know, buy your ticket, but also instructions inside of infrastructure or near infrastructure. Walk this way, go this way. What do you think? I mean, we're talking to engineers here now. Who's the ecosystem that needs to be talked to? Do we need to be do car companies need to be bringing in and engineers, Google and Move It and Transit app and some of these city-based planning applications essentially into the design of their vehicle?
The broad general answer is yes, absolutely. They need to bring these people to the table. They need to look at the complete trip, the overall journey, and how that vehicle can react to the individual's needs. You know, there's kind of, I talked about the physical nature, the digital nature, right? We can do so much to the physical nature that will meet the needs of a huge swath of the population that's currently not being met, right? But we need to think holistically about how we're going to integrate these digital applications into the overall experience and make it personal. So beyond just what you're describing, what cities are doing, right, which is kind of multimodal payment, kind of public and private assets, pulling all out together, that is a huge monumental task and is so worth it in the end. We need to take that framework and build from it. We need to build on top of it. We need to make it more personal, right? We have the ability to do this. We have very, very smart people in this world who can make those sorts of things happen. But if you're an OEM in particular, you need to come to the table with solutions. And I'm going to add one more thing here too. And what I mean by that is complete solutions, right? That meet the needs of the city, that meet the needs of healthcare. And because they're all very unique, they all want the same thing, but all their needs are very unique and aging. I also want to make this one comment, which is cities need to stop taking what they're giving and they need to start demanding what they need. Because for 6 years, I've heard cities sit in a room and talk about how they need an accessible and barrier-free vehicle, that they need these assets to integrate with their overall fixed and non-fixed assets. Cities need to start demanding these things. They have the power to drive this forward. Because if we're looking at this from an opportunity perspective, we're not just talking about a couple of dozen vehicles. We're talking the potential of millions of vehicles around the country and around the world that could meet these needs. But cities need to begin to demand these things. Don't just take what you're given. Ask for what you need.
Well, it's interesting. So I guess one of our commenters here is talking about May Mobility, and they've got some interesting news. So May Mobility is going to be launching in Ann Arbor, and they're going to be working with the CNN minivan, I believe, you know, there's an opportunity right in front of us to see if we can pull off some autonomous accessibility, you know, in a vehicle like that. Now, obviously, the Sienna is what it is.
Yep.
But, you know, are there opportunities there to, especially in these smaller cities,
Yeah.
to prove out that? So I kind of want to go back to that because I know we talked a little bit about recommendations. And I know I'm pinning you down a little bit, but like if you were master of the universe, let's take Ann Arbor, because now we've got a real pilot going on. Okay. It's going on in one of our friendly local cities here, at least to me.
Yep.
What can we go, if we went to the city of Ann Arbor and went to May Mobility, what can we say to them to do, or they should do? Let's name some things. We identify some curbs.
Yeah.
Are we going to map the city first and say, okay, these are the good curves? Are we going to, you know, put in some coloring? Are we going to design the interior and say, this iconography that you have here, we want to match it in this urban environment? You know, what are some list of things we could do?
Yeah. So cities really need to look at, and the jury, by the way, is still out on this, Michael, as you know, but cities need to really look at enabling their infrastructure, curbs, sidewalks, things like that. What kind of sensors are we using? What kind of communication schema are we using between infrastructure and the vehicles themselves, if any, right? So it's really kind of investing in the infrastructure that the cities have control over, I think is going to be critically important moving forward, because we're talking at this point in time, baby steps, right? But the idea that we could coordinate design languages, the idea that we could coordinate those design languages between the vehicle and infrastructure, we can take those opportunities. We can pilot those things. We can look at consumers' reactions, end users' reactions to those sorts of things. So if I was master of the universe, I would be kind of ticking the boxes moving forward. If I have a Sienna with me right now, right, I'm going to maximize that experience that I possibly can with that Sienna, right? I'm going to try to do as much as I possibly can. But we all know ultimately that what we're describing here is a clean sheet of paper and a vehicle built from the ground up to be able to manifest that level boarding, that high head clearance, those sorts of things. So although we're in a world right now where I think many OEMs are looking at moving accessibility forward with current vehicle platforms, there is a massive opportunity that we cannot miss with AV shuttles. And we need to start looking at those before we start locking down designs, before we start locking down those engineering designs in particular. We need to be able to take these things into account. So cities, from their perspective, investing in infrastructure, testing, looking at the design languages between the two, looking at those applications that people will be using to plan their trip. All of these things need to be moved forward. We need to be able to move these things in baby steps till we can kind of get to that full integration and that really systems approach to mobility for cities.
One thing I'm wondering about is, it seems like with shuttles, and maybe I'm wrong, they're like the tension between styling, and you know, functionality is not nearly as much as it is on, you know, if I go to Mercedes-Benz and say, hey, I'd really like you to, you know, not jack up your SUVs as much, I'd like you to do X and Y, they're going to say, thanks for the, you know, I appreciate that feedback and move on and you know, and not do what I just asked them to do, right? So I'm wondering in terms of styling, and this is really more of a statement than a question, does it matter? Should we just move to a point where it's like, we must do these things because this is going to help the greatest number of people, right? So, you know,
but this is the challenge, right, Michael, which is, can we, for lack of a better term, can we produce a shuttle that's sexy, right?
Right.
Yes, I believe we can. Those things that designers and engineers do best still hold true in the future, right? Mm-hmm. We still want an attractive vehicle on the road. We still want all of these things. We still want comfort in the vehicle. But then comfort takes on a different meaning. Comfort to whom? Right?
Mhm.
Comfort to an individual who wants to feel safe, who's in a manual wheelchair and needs to be locked down in the cabin, right? Comfortable to the person who has all of their abilities, right? And wants a lumbar bolster. All of these things are solvable in the future. We have to look at them through a different lens, though. And it doesn't mean that there won't be individual autonomous vehicles that may want to take advantage of these things around universal design, particularly people like your wife who are petite, right? Who have a difficult time getting into a high SUV. Why can't that Lincoln Navigator, that Yukon, that Highlander, why can't they lower? They can. We have the technology. This is completely possible. So you have to stop looking at this as a constraint. You have to start looking at this as a design constraint and look at it as an opportunity. There is a positive business model associated with meeting the needs of more people than less.
Yeah, when in interviewing the cities though, and you talked about this, spending a lot of time in the cities, what were their big fears about moving to a technology like this? Was it cost, or was it that they would, did they express anxieties, or did they just express what they really needed?
Well, they did express what they needed, but they also did express anxieties. And I will tell you that when they talk about autonomy, the first thing that comes on, and this is just being brutally honest, is drivers who are part of a union, right? Bus drivers, things like that, putting people out of work. And what we are saying here is that what we're talking about with an AV shuttle is that it's going to fill a need that isn't currently being filled. So we're not talking about replacing people. We're talking about adding functionality to the overall mobility ecosystem in that city, right? So not replacement, but complementing all of those other assets the city will leverage. And by the way, that also includes TNCs, people like Lyft and Uber. We're not talking about replacing them. We're talking about integrating them into the overall mobility solution. So that was an anxiety that they would definitely express. The other anxieties are anxieties that we also associate with commonly right now with AVs, which is safety and security, right? Personal security around my data. If I'm going to share my individual needs and what I need from the vehicle experience, from the overall mobility experience, they want to make sure that that is completely safe. Safety in the sense of individuals who may be riding in a vehicle that have never ridden in a vehicle before like this, an individual who is blind or uses a manual wheelchair or an electric wheelchair. We want to make sure that those people are safe and secure in the vehicle. So these are all kind of not stumbling blocks, but things that we need to address for cities as we start to present them with solutions in the future.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things that we probably need, from the engineering community is some, and I don't know the answers, maybe you know this, like reasons why vehicles, like will there be with autonomy changes in the regulations that regulate the form factor of a vehicle to maybe enable the design a little bit more, because the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Act, it includes all these things that need to be done. Now, not only are we thinking about going to autonomous, but we're totally changing the design theoretically.
Yes.
And so I feel like there are some moving parts that are difficult to, we can tell all these great engineers that you guys need to take this into account, but what they're able to do is somewhat limited right now without a little bit of guidance from the federal government about what are you allowed to do,
Yes.
in terms of changing the, it's not just about accessibility, it's all these other legacy regulations that they're going to have to be followed. I don't know if any of that was encompassed. And then after that, I just want to open up to questions if you have any answer on that.
So let me make this a quick answer. Absolutely, we need policy. We need policy coming from the top down. We need it coming from the federal government. There's a lot of movement, as you know, Michael, in Congress right now around certain bills around AV policy. Those things need to make their way through, and they need to be critically informed by the industry itself. But we need policy, because policy will determine how and when we start to move forward with these opportunities. That is quite frankly why we're trying to get to a roadmap that we can share in December of this year, because policy will be absolutely critically important moving forward. And I'll leave it at that for that.
Okay. Well, I wanted to, now we really like to, we got a few questions that came in. You know, there was one here that Bill Shellman put in, and I'd love for you to maybe ask it again, that I didn't quite understand it. And the question is does the AV and infrastructure display the color, even if there's not a cognitive challenge passenger on the board? Maybe I didn't quite understand that. Tim, do you understand it?
Yes, I think I know where Bill's going with this. So, so Bill, our view of this is that we're creating a back end that can be served up based on the individual's needs. This is why we talk about personalization up front, which means that if I have a cognitive, let's say I have autism, right? I'm going to want the information served up in a way for my trip that meets my particular needs, right? So if I'm also a blind individual, I may be getting audio cues through my headset from my phone. If I'm a wheelchair user, the vehicle is going to act accordingly when it arrives to pick me up. What we're talking about is the same back end, but we're serving up the information in different ways dependent on the individual's abilities. So as I mentioned with cognitive abilities, it's extremely important that they can basically reference where they are and what they're doing at all times, right? To kind of eliminate confusion, to reduce stress and anxiety. So the ability to look at my itinerary and where I am in real time in that itinerary may be extremely important to an individual with a cognitive disability, but someone with all of their disabilities, no, they're just going to be taking the audio cues and the visuals on the screens inside of the vehicle, right, to navigate their way through their complete trip. But as we said, we're talking about creating a back end that can then personally serve up the information. It's the same information, but served up in different ways depending on the individual's needs. I hope that answers the question.
Well, does anyone else have any other questions? And I mean, you can either put it in the chat or Stephanie, I don't know if you want to, how else you want to do it. I think that if you want to add any questions we can address from the audience, and or anything to circle back to the study itself that you're interested in.
Yep. Oh, thank you, Bill. You know, Mike, there is, I think it's Layla said, so it sounds like many of these design recommendations would be helpful to people with or without disabilities. Absolutely. When you talk about universal design and you start to get into what universal design is, it is literally the looking at kind of everyone's needs, not just solving for edge cases, but literally solving for edge cases that meet the needs of all. So as I said in the presentation, level boarding is extraordinarily important to people with a physical disability, people in a wheelchair or using a quad cane or a walker. But think about moms with strollers, think about business travelers with luggage. Everyone benefits. Everyone benefits from zero entry, right? And that's kind of why it's kind of our number one from the physical side of this. Any other questions? I'd be more than happy to answer anything.
Well, one thing, like Tim said, you're going to be able to access this. And then I would just, since you are on this call and you expressed some interest, obviously, in this area, I think it's important for us as a community to just start bringing it up. When we're in, when we have the moment to talk about accessibility. I encourage us to stop talking about things in terms of this is for ADA requirements and more about what can we do to make this vehicle as easy to use for the largest group of people as possible.
Yes.
And I really think that I really would like, to have that takeaway.
I can't agree with you more. And stop framing it as an obligation. Think of it as an opportunity. Just as Mike said, for all, right? Everyone is going to benefit. When you have the opportunity, be an advocate, but also acknowledge the business opportunity, right? When we do this, when we think of it as an opportunity and not an obligation, it changes the narrative completely.
Well, and also, so Billy has a, question kind of comment about, how do we frame this as a business opportunity? And I think that the real way to do it is to think about any vehicle or design that we put together that is exclusionary. If it's exclusionary and designed to be a Ferrari or something, it's exclusionary from cost, and people are, they want a few things from that vehicle. But when we're talking about designing vehicles that are getting people around, and they have a very single purpose, which is getting people around comfortably, on time, safely, then any design choices that we make that limit the number of people that can use it are, definitely limiting the market size. But more than that, if they're limiting it to people who really need the transportation, right, versus people who can take it or leave it, then you're excluding the best part of the market, right? So to speak. And I don't mean to make it sound all transactional, but it is true, right? Like, why would you exclude the people who really, really could take advantage of it, as opposed to just people who are casual?
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. Love that.
Stephanie has a series of questions. Do you want to take a look at those, Tim, or do you want me to? So basically, what can cities do moving forward in relation to AV shuttles and the needs of their constituents? And another question I meant to ask you is, what does meeting the needs of 85% really mean from a universal design perspective?
Sure. So that 85% has been a lightning rod in every conversation that we've had since December of this year. And we're really putting it out there because it's not currently being addressed. We don't look at meeting the needs of 85% of the general public. And it needs to be taken advantage of, that percentage. And what I mean by that is it gets us to think differently. It gets us to think about, how do we meet the needs of the majority versus the minority, but majority including individuals that we currently could be providing mobility equity to, but currently are not. So individuals who would be best served by this vehicle, meeting the needs of 85% makes, quite frankly, the majority happy. But by putting in zero entry, by putting in high head clearance, which we think are absolutely mandatory in that 85%, we're going to be pulling people into this experience that have not been able to be in this experience because they've had to utilize things like paratransit. And that's why we talk about that last 15%. And we need to do more work on this. I'm not going to acknowledge that 85% is the be all and end all. But if we look at this just from that perspective, when we start talking about it openly, that last 15% may have very specific needs that will need to be addressed in a paratransit type of vehicle, right? May not be that vehicle that is used by cities. It may be a vehicle, though, that is used by the healthcare industry. It may be a vehicle that is used by the aging industry, right? So we're talking about not necessarily just one form factor, but multiple types of form factors. And the 85% is just a representation of underserved. If we start thinking about 85%, we're going to start meeting the needs of the majority by leveraging universal design.
Great. Well, we've kind of, sort of run through most of the questions, but, oh yeah, I mean, here's an interesting, thought that Victoria's put in, is that wheelchair users do spend a lot of money on retrofitting their vehicles, and then, then they're not secured safely, right?
So let me take a different, I want to take a different tact on this. So there is, when you talk about upfitting a vehicle, let's say for an electric wheelchair, right? there's certain kind of fail safes that go into that experience, because you're working with upfitters like Brawnability and others that actually do these vehicles. These vehicles are extraordinarily expensive to meet the needs of those individuals, right, who want an individual vehicle. In some cases, these vehicles in the end can cost up to $150,000, right? You may be starting with a base vehicle that's $45,000, you're ending with a vehicle that's about $145,000. And who is paying for that? Well, the Department of Labor basically funds individual states' efforts to get people to work and to jobs. And there are opportunities for people to get grants to underwrite the costs of these vehicles. And in many cases, the individual does not bear the cost of the upfit. So that $100,000 is coming out of state coffers. When you step back from that, you ask yourself the question, if I could provide public transportation that would meet their needs, I can eliminate that $100,000, right, of expenditure spent by the state and the federal government. Now, everyone is going to, there may be a preference in the future for people to have individual vehicles, but quite frankly, when we start to look at the opportunity that 85% in a SAV vehicle, a shuttle vehicle, and by being able to meet the needs of having mobility on demand for these people, then we're starting to talk about a reduction of cost associated with meeting those people's needs and getting them to a job, because we can get them to a job leveraging the assets that the city can provide if we do it right.
Listen, I think that's a great place to wrap it up. And I know we're kind of out of time anyway, but Tim, I really appreciate you spending the time talking about this with me. And I know that Tim will be happy to follow up with anyone who has questions about this and wants to also learn a little bit more about POCO Labs and the work that he's doing. So thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful remainder of your week, and stay safe out there.
Thank you, Michael. Very, very great conversation. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Take care.